There are places in this world where the wind does not blow, and yet the trees still sway. Where silence is not peace, but a warning. Welcome to FolkFear. Here we unearth the forgotten rituals buried beneath cracked soil and faded tombstones. We whisper the names that were meant never to be spoken, and we walk the worn paths of cursed villages, where time no longer flows and the dead never rest. Tonight's story is one such path, a feast that must be held in silence, or the past will speak again. This is the Feast of Withered Voices, a tale of betrayal that rotted a village from within, of a curse passed down by blood, of river stones that remember every scream, even the ones never heard. So lean in, don't speak, and listen carefully. Because some stories don't want to be told, but they demand to be heard. Kaun had never planned to return to Bon Sek. The road back home wasn't a road at all, but a scar etched into the mountains, winding through overgrown brush and forgotten farmland, barely wide enough for a motorbike to slip through. It was the kind of path that punished memory, that scraped the souls of those who dared return, and whispered that some places were meant to be left behind. But the call had come 2 weeks ago. His father was dead. No explanation, no ceremony, just a note, written in trembling, unfamiliar handwriting, and delivered through an uncle he barely remembered. Return before the feast. It's your turn now. Kaun didn't understand what that meant, but in Bon Sek, understanding was often the last step before fear. He arrived at the edge of the village just before dusk. The air carried the weight of something unsaid. He could feel it pressing against his eardrums, not quite a sound, but a pressure, a hush, a warning. Even the birds had gone quiet, and the bamboo thicket stood unnaturally still, as if they too feared the wind. The houses were the same, stilted wooden huts with corrugated tin roofs and chicken wire fences, warped by time and weather. But the people, they watched him differently. Children peered from behind wooden shutters, their mouths wrapped with thin red cords. The elders sat on their porches stringing dried herbs into garlands, but none raised a hand in greeting, none smiled, and none spoke. It wasn't until he reached his family's home, a sagging teak structure near the dried riverbed, that someone dared to break the silence. "Boy," croaked a voice, and he turned to see a hunched woman leaning on a cane, eyes clouded by age but sharp with something deeper, recognition, or maybe memory sharpened into suspicion. "You shouldn't have come back. Not now, not this year." Kaun took a step forward. "I'm here for my father. I got a message." The woman's mouth tightened. "Then you already know. You came for the feast." "I don't understand what that means." She stared at him for a long moment, then pointed her cane toward the riverbed. "You'll remember soon enough." His father's house smelled of old incense and something bitter underneath, like burnt bark or spoiled rice, the scent of rituals left half-finished. He wandered through the empty rooms, each one more dust-covered than the last. His father had clearly lived alone and for a long time. Plates were stacked but not used. The sleeping mat hadn't been moved in weeks. yet everything was meticulously placed, as if arranged for someone else to find it. On the altar near the back window sat a small clay jar, sealed with black wax and bound in red thread. Count reached for it, only for the door to creak behind him. He turned. No one was there, just the wind brushing through the wall slats, and yet he could have sworn he heard something beneath it. A whisper. His name. That night, he lit a single lantern and sat in the center of the main room. Sleep didn't come easily, not with the silence pressing down on him like wet cloth, not with the memory of that red cord around the child's mouth or the old woman's warning. Sometime after midnight, he heard footsteps outside, slow, measured, as if someone were walking in deliberate circles around the house. He rose and approached the window, careful not to breathe too loudly. The moon hadn't risen, he couldn't see much, but as his eyes adjusted, he made out shapes moving just beyond the tree line, shapes that didn't walk like people. They slithered, low to the ground, with limbs too long and heads bowed as if listening for something buried beneath the earth. He stepped back from the window, heart pounding. Then came a sharp knock at the door. Once, twice, then silence. He didn't move. He barely breathed. The knock never came again. By morning, the air had changed. There was no sun, only a dim gray wash across the horizon, like the sky had forgotten how to rise. Count stepped outside to find the village already moving. Elders carried baskets of rice and ash down toward the riverbed. Young women lit incense without flame, holding their hands above it as though miming fire. And children stood in rows, silent, unmoving, faces painted with ash. He approached a man he recognized, his Uncle Teen, broad-shouldered and gaunt, with the same sunken eyes that had run through our family for generations. "I don't understand. What's going on? What is this feast everyone keeps mentioning?" Teen glanced around, then pulled Count aside behind a shack covered in dried banana leaves. "It's not a feast like you know. Not food, not celebration. It's an offering." "To what?" "To those who never left." Teen looked toward the riverbed, now cracked, dry, and lined with smooth stones that shimmered faintly despite the absence of light. There was a betrayal long ago. Blood was sold for safety. The village never recovered. So every 9th year, we offer what we can, silently. No voices, no prayers, just silence until dawn. And if someone breaks the silence, Teen's jaw tightened, then the earth remembers. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. Count felt it in the bones of the village, in the way no one looked directly at him, in the way the stones seemed to hum without sound, in the way the trees leaned inward as if listening. This wasn't a ritual, it was a warning, and he was already too deep inside it. That night, as the sky darkened into moonless velvet and every lantern was extinguished, the village fell silent. Not one person spoke, not a whisper, not even a breath too sharp. The silence was not peaceful. It was suffocating. Even the crickets refused to sing. Count sat alone on the wooden floor, hands trembling as he held the sealed clay jar left behind by his father. He didn't open it. He didn't dare. But he felt something inside it pulse like a second heartbeat. Outside, he could hear movement, not footsteps, Not animals, but something older, something bound in stone and silence. And as the hours stretched long into the void of night, Kaun realized something truly terrible. The silence wasn't holding them in, it was holding something else out. And it was hungry. The next morning brought no sunrise, only a pale, washed-out glow that felt more like an afterthought than daylight. A stillness clung to the air, heavy and damp. Kun woke to find his clothes faintly wet with dew, though the house had been sealed tight. Outside, a thin mist rolled along the ground like smoke searching for fire. He stepped onto the porch, blinking away sleep, and saw them. Villagers kneeling in a long line beside the old riverbed. Each one placed a single bowl on the earth, a gray paste made of ash, rice, and moss. They bowed their heads, not in reverence, but in surrender. And not a single sound escaped their lips. He remembered what his uncle had said, "No voices until dawn." But dawn had already passed, and still the silence held. Kun followed the path down to the dry riverbed. The air grew colder as he approached. The closer he got, the more the mist thickened until it felt alive, as though it breathed against his skin. The bed itself was wide and cracked, littered with stones smooth as bone. Hundreds of them, thousands perhaps, each one lined perfectly along the dried current, glinting faintly beneath the haze. He crouched down, brushing dust from one of them. It was icy cold, almost painfully so, even though the air was warm. Tiny grooves ran across its surface, lines that at first seemed natural, but as he looked closer, he saw shapes within them. Symbols. Writing. No alphabet he knew, something older, carved by hands that hadn't known mercy. He turned the stone over. A hairline crack ran through its center, filled with something dark. Not dirt, not mold, something sticky. He rubbed his thumb across it. Red. He froze. It couldn't be blood. The stones were ancient, and yet, when he lifted his hand to the light, the smear glistened fresh. A sound rippled through the mist, soft, like the hiss of air through teeth. Kun's heart lurched. He turned, scanning the banks. Nothing moved. No one stood there. Yet the air trembled again, forming faint syllables that brushed against his ears like breath. Kun. He stepped back sharply, the stone slipping from his hand. It hit the ground with a muffled thud, rolling against another. The moment it touched, a faint streak of red appeared along the second stone's surface, like veins waking beneath skin. He stumbled backward, breathing hard. The stones were bleeding. By midday, the mist had thinned, but the unease had not. Kun went to find his Uncle Teen, who was repairing fishing nets near the storage hut. Teen didn't look up as Kun approached. "The stones," Kun said, voice low. "There's something wrong with them." Teen's hands stopped moving. He exhaled slowly, then motioned for Kun to lower his voice. "They always bleed," he said, barely above a whisper, "but only when they remember." "Remember what?" Teen looked toward the riverbed. "The blood that filled them, the betrayal that made them." Kun frowned. "You mean someone died there?" Teen's eyes hardened. "Not someone. Everyone." He told the story in fragments, as if the words themselves were dangerous. Long ago, when the land was still ruled by soldiers and strangers, Bonsek struck a deal. An outsider offered the elders protection, food, medicine, safety from raids, in exchange for one thing: names. The names of those who resisted. And one man gave them. He was Kun's ancestor. When the soldiers came, they dragged the villagers into the river and slaughtered them one by one. Their bodies were left to rot until the rains came. The river turned red. When it dried, it left behind smooth stones streaked with dark lines, lines that the elders claimed were veins carrying the memory of blood. They say the souls of the betrayed were bound inside them, so that the traitor's bloodline would never escape their gaze. Kuhn's chest tightened. Bound? How? By silence, Teen said. The old ones believed words had weight, that speaking gave power to the wrong kind of ghosts. So every 9 years, when the feast comes, we give the dead our silence. We remind them we still remember. Kuhn looked toward the hills where the gray sky sagged heavy with smoke. And if we forget? Teen's jaw clenched. Then they feed. That night, Kuhn couldn't shake the image of the stones bleeding beneath his touch. He sat by the altar again, the clay jar before him. He traced the red string wound around it, 3 times clockwise, once counter, an old protective knot. His father had always warned him never to cut red thread. He didn't know why, not until now. He brought the jar close to his ear. Silence. Then, so faint he almost missed it, a sound like breathing, shallow, slow, as if someone was trapped inside. He set the jar down and pushed back. The silence in the house deepened. Outside, the wind began to move through the trees, but not like before. This time it carried rhythm, a pulse, almost human. And under that pulse came whispers, not words, not yet, but the shape of them, a language forming itself from the spaces between heartbeats. He covered his ears, but it was no use. The sound wasn't in the air, it was inside him. By dawn, the whispers had stopped, but the air smelled faintly of iron. He stepped outside, eyes raw from lack of sleep. A group of villagers had gathered near the riverbed again. They were staring at something half buried in the dirt. Kuhn pushed through them. What he saw made his stomach twist. A goat lay there, throat torn open, its blood pooling into the cracks of the dry river. But what chilled him most wasn't the animal's body. It was the stones beneath it. They had turned red, every one of them, as if drinking. The elders began murmuring, soft, fearful noises, not speech, but broken sounds between breaths. Kuhn looked at his uncle. "This isn't normal," he said. "This isn't just ritual." Teen didn't answer. He stared at the stones with hollow eyes, whispering a prayer Kuhn couldn't hear. Finally he turned. "It's beginning early this year," he said. "The dead are impatient." That evening Kuhn walked the perimeter of the village. Everywhere he went, he saw the red cords, the same ones he'd noticed on the children, tied around door handles, around necks, around the wrists of sleeping elders. They pulsed faintly, like veins. He stopped by the river again. The blood had dried, but the stones remained dark. He knelt beside one, running a hand over its slick surface. This time, it was warm. And as his fingers brushed its edge, a faint voice breathed up through the soil. A woman's voice, cracked with sorrow. "He sold us for silver." Kuhn's heart lurched. "Who?" The voice trembled, distant. "His blood is yours." Then silence. Kuhn stood quickly, stumbling backward. The mist thickened again, curling around his ankles like grasping fingers. He looked down. The stone he'd touched was now streaked with blood. Not fresh this time, old, blackened, and yet still wet to the touch. He turned and ran. Behind him the air filled with the faintest of sounds, not screams, but sighs, thousands of them, all whispering his name. Back at the house he locked every door and window. He poured salt along the thresholds like his father had once done before every feast. He sat against the wall, clutching the sealed jar. His hands trembled as he whispered to no one. "Father, what did you do?" The jar pulsed once, as if in reply, and from somewhere deep inside it, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A heartbeat, not his. Kuhn stood by the riverbed long after the others had gone. The stones no longer bled. They rested in eerie stillness beneath the mid-morning haze, like grave markers for those who had died without names. He wanted to believe it was over, that the goat's blood, the whispering, the dreams, they were all remnants of his frayed memory returning home after too long. But deep down, something inside him had changed. The land was not simply cursed. It was listening. He returned to the house and found a woman waiting on the porch. She was small, wrapped in a long black scarf despite the thick humidity. Her back was hunched, and her mouth was covered with a folded cloth tied behind her head. But her eyes, milky white and sunken, followed him with unsettling precision. Before he could speak, she raised her finger to her lips, not in greeting, in warning. She held out a wooden bowl. Inside was a mound of pale rice mixed with ash, thin strands of what looked like dried moss, and tiny fragments of brittle white bone, like powdered teeth. The smell was sour, fungal, but not unfamiliar. It was the scent of rituals. She pressed the bowl into his hands and gestured toward the house. Then she walked away without a sound, vanishing into the mist like a spirit that had briefly mistaken him for someone else. Tien arrived not long after. "You met Old May?" he asked. Kuhn nodded, showing him the bowl. "She gave me this." Tien looked at the contents and nodded solemnly. "It's the base for the offering. We mix it ourselves. Rice from the harvest, ash from the old altar, moss from the riverbanks, and bone from those who came before." Kuhn looked again, this time noticing the brittle bone pieces glittered faintly in the light. "From the dead?" he asked. "From our ancestors," Tien corrected. "Those who died during the massacre. We grind them finely every 9 years, so that each offering carries a voice that can no longer speak." Kuhn nearly dropped the bowl. Tien gestured for him to follow, and they stepped inside the house. He set the offering down beside the hearth. "We eat none of it. We offer it in silence, leave it for the night, and take nothing back. If even a single grain is missing by morning, the land accepts our silence. If not—" Kuhn's stomach twisted. "If not?" he whispered. Tien looked toward the window, where the mist clung like mold to the outside world. "Then the stones aren't satisfied, and they call out for more." They worked through the afternoon. Other villagers came and went in small, silent groups, exchanging nothing but nods, eyes avoiding one another, footsteps muffled beneath the soft soil. In the courtyard, long tables were laid out with dozens of bowls just like Kuhn's. No meat, no oil, no sweetness, only the same bitter paste. Each was sealed with a red thread looped in a figure-8 pattern and marked with a drop of oil at the center, a black circle drawn with soot and sap resembling an eye that never blinked. Kuhn helped where he could, though no one instructed him. Some seemed afraid to get too close. Others touched their red cords whenever he passed. It was as if they sensed something in him, or worse, remembered something. At sunset, a single bell rang from the elder's hut. Once, then silence. That was the sign. Every voice vanished. Every breath grew careful. The Feast of Withered Voices had begun. Kun sat alone beside the altar. In front of him lay his bowl, untouched, unscented, unmoving. Outside, the village was deathly quiet. Not even the insects dared sing. He kept the clay jar close, its red thread warm under his fingers. He didn't know why, but touching it made his chest feel lighter, like his father's breath still lingered within. Then, from the back of the house, he heard the softest sound, fabric rustling. He turned. A woman stood in the doorway. She was weeping. No sobs, no gasping breath, just silent tears streaming down her face, wetting the cord tied across her mouth. She held a bundle in her arms, a small child wrapped tightly, too still to be sleeping. She stepped inside, placed the child on the floor before the altar, and dropped to her knees. Her hands trembled as she reached to untie the cord at her mouth. Kun rushed forward. He held out his hand, shaking his head furiously, mouthing, "No!" But the woman didn't stop. Her grief was heavier than fear. She tore the cloth away and whispered a name, "Chai." It came out like breath into a fire. Instantly the house groaned, the clay jar cracked, the walls seemed to shudder, not from wind, but from something ancient pressing inward. From beneath the floorboards, a low moan rose, like air being drawn through a throat filled with dirt. Kun backed away. The woman's eyes went wide. She clutched her child's body close, but the floor split beneath her knees. Thin fingers of wet black soil erupted upward and pulled her down. Not fast, not violent, slow, purposeful, like the earth itself was reclaiming what had been stolen. She didn't scream. She couldn't. The soil silenced her again. And within seconds, she was gone. Only the red cord remained, resting on the floor like a shed skin. The child's body was gone too, as if it had never been there. Kun didn't move for hours, not until the red string began to curl in on itself, tightening like a noose. The jar beside him hissed, a thin stream of vapor leaking from a fresh crack in the wax seal. He wrapped it tightly in cloth and placed it in a chest, binding it shut with rope. Then he walked to the front of the house. The village was still quiet, but now he could feel the weight of new silence. He wasn't alone in what he'd witnessed. Others had heard. Others had seen. But they would say nothing. They never did. At dawn, the bell rang once more. Kun stepped outside. The mist had returned, thicker than before, now clinging to the rooftops, turning every home into a dim shadow. Near the riverbed, a group of villagers had gathered again. They knelt beside the offerings. Kun watched from a distance as they inspected the bowls. One by one, each elder shook their head. Nothing had been taken. None of the rice had vanished, not a grain disturbed. The dead were not appeased. Tien appeared at Kun's side. His face was drawn, pale. "Someone broke it," he whispered. Kun didn't answer. He watched as the eldest woman, Old May, lifted one of the bone rice bowls and scattered it across the riverbed, chanting soundlessly through lips that didn't move. Tien turned to Kun. "They'll blame someone," he said. "Who?" Tien met his eyes with quiet finality. "You."
There are nights the sky forgets to breathe. This was one of them. Not a single star pierced the darkness, not a flicker of the moon. Only blackness, thick and weightless, poured over the village like ink spilled across parchment. Kun had never known a night so still. No wind moved, no bird stirred. Even the mist had withdrawn, as if the land itself had paused to listen. At the center of Bansak, the villagers stood like shadows. Each held a bowl, each wore a red cord. Each had taped their mouths shut with cloth soaked in salt water and ash, an old method of sealing the voice, Tien had explained. And none would speak again until dawn. The offering procession began at midnight. A bell rang once from the elder's hut, low and hollow, like a heartbeat echoing from within the earth. Then silence. One by one, the villagers began moving toward the riverbed, slow, synchronized, barefoot. Kun followed behind them, the bowl of bone rice cradled in both hands. His own mouth was uncovered, though he said nothing. No one had given him a cord. He felt the omission like a curse. The riverbed had been transformed. Dozens of stone altars, blackened with time, had been unearthed from beneath the soil. Flat, cracked slabs of ancient rock, arranged in two long lines. Between them, the dry bed itself lay like an open scar in the land. Each villager approached an altar, placed their bowl upon it, bowed 3 times in silence, and backed away without turning. Turning your back on the offering was forbidden. To do so was to invite the dead to follow. Kun moved slowly, watching as the old woman from the day before, the one who had wept for her child, stepped forward again. But something was different. Her hands were empty. Her bowl was gone. Her offering never made. And yet she walked the same path, knelt before an empty altar, and bowed 3 times in the hollow dark. A mimicry of devotion, a ghost in motion. Kun's breath caught in his throat. When he stood again, he saw her eyes were glazed, not with grief, but with silence. Something inside her had been taken. He approached his own altar. It was smaller than the rest, barely more than a jagged slab protruding from the dirt, but it felt heavier beneath his hands than anything he had ever carried. He set the bowl down, bowed once, twice, and paused. Something moved beneath the altar, a tremor, a pulse. He forced his head down a 3rd time, and just as he rose, he saw it. A hand, thin, gray, crawling from beneath the altar. It gripped the edge of the stone, dragging what remained of a body behind it. Not whole, not rotting, just wrong. No one else reacted. No one screamed, no one looked. Kun's lips parted, an instinct to call out, to warn, to shout. But Tien's hand clamped around his wrist before he could make a sound. His uncle's eyes, wide with fear, shook his head once. "Don't." And Kun swallowed the scream back into his stomach. The feast continued. For hours the villagers stood in complete stillness. Not a word, not a cough, not a single exhale too loud. Even the dogs had vanished.
Even the trees had stilled. The dead were walking, but no one dared to see them. Kuhn's vision blurred. His legs ached. His throat burned with unspoken questions. But something deeper was happening beneath his skin. The silence was not simply external. It had begun to crawl into him. He could feel it in his bones, a pressure building behind the ribs, whispering through the tendons like wind trapped in old pipes. Then came the voices, not out loud, not around him, inside. One at first, then another, then dozens, layered, shifting, breathing. He hears them. He should not be here. His blood is still warm. Let him speak. Let him break. Let him finish what his father failed to do. Kuhn dropped to his knees, clutching his head, the bowl at his altar cracking in two behind him. The bone fragments spilled like teeth. The stones beneath his knees pulsed warm. Blood seeped upward, not dripping down from anything, but rising from the earth itself. And yet, the village did not stir. They saw, but they did not move. Their mouths were shut by choice or by something older. Kuhn wanted to run, but the earth was no longer letting him go. Somewhere behind him, a child began to hum, just a note, low, soft, like a lullaby. Heads turned, not at once, but in slow unison, the spell of silence broken by that single innocent sound. A woman screamed, not from pain, but from knowing. The child vanished. One blink, gone. The humming stopped. So did the air. Then the stones began to bleed again. This time, all of them. Hundreds. Bleed from every carved groove, every etched symbol, turning the riverbed into a latticework of pain and memory. The ground trembled, and a voice, not human, roared from beneath the soil. One voice broke the pact. One blood must be returned. The elders dropped to their knees, bowing to the stones. Kuhn remained frozen. The blood beneath his feet was warm now. His own hands were shaking. The villagers began chanting without sound, mouths opening and closing in rhythm, forming shapes their throats could no longer echo. A ritual of mute desperation. But it was too late. The feast was broken. The dead had tasted sound again, and they wanted more. At sunrise, the silence cracked. Birds cried. Dogs barked in the distance. But the village was no longer whole. 6 homes stood empty. No one remembered the names of those who lived there. Their offerings had been taken, but they had not been enough. The altars were gone, vanished back into the earth. All that remained were the bleeding stones. Kuhn stumbled back to his house, feet stained with drying blood. The clay jar pulsed behind his walls like a buried drum. Tien waited for him inside. His voice was barely above a whisper. "You should not have stayed." Kuhn's mouth felt dry. What happened? Tien looked away. The pact is broken. And now? Tien's hands trembled as he untied the red cord from around his neck and placed it on the table. Now we prepare for the price.
The sky bloomed in the wrong color. At first, Kuhn thought it was just the haze again,
another smothering dawn like the ones before. But this light was different. It was pink. Not soft or gentle like morning light, but lurid and sharp, like bruised skin stretched across the heavens. The trees shimmered with frost, and the scent in the air was all wrong. Sweet, almost sickly, like fruit left to rot inside a closed room. He stepped outside his house and stopped dead. Ban Sek had changed overnight. Flowers had bloomed where no flowers should have. The ground, once hard and dry, now pulsed with bright red fungi in the shapes of hands. Mango trees, which should have borne no fruit for months, sagged heavy with swollen, overripe clusters that split open in the heat, oozing dark juice that crawled with flies. The old shrine near the river had cracked in two. The incense holders were gone. In their place were teeth. Dozens of human teeth set into the dirt in a perfect circle. Kun stepped back, bile rising in his throat. Then he saw the scarecrows, 3 of them, new. Each stood at the edge of the fields, facing inward, toward the village instead of the road. Their faces were covered in cloth. Their bodies wore the clothes of the missing, and from their mouths, red cords dangled like pulled veins. The villagers didn't speak of it. They didn't speak at all. They moved in silence, burying bowls from the feast in deep pits behind their homes. They sprinkled salt across thresholds. They sewed their lips with thread, not as punishment, but as surrender. Kun watched one woman do it without flinching, the needle piercing flesh as if stitching fabric. And still, no one looked at him, as if he had already become something else. Tien brought him food he couldn't eat, rice that smelled like rainwater, eggs that leaked black when cracked. "Don't eat from the land," Tien whispered. "It's not ours anymore." Kun stared at the food. "But why is it happening now? The feast, wasn't that meant to prevent this?" Tien sat down heavily beside him. "We were late, and someone broke the silence. The bloodline stirred." Kun looked up. "What do you mean, the bloodline?" Tien hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Every generation, one from the traitor's blood must remain. That's the rule. If they die, if they leave, the voices return. The stones wake." Kun's blood turned cold. "So, my father, he stayed?" Tien nodded. "He knew what he was. That's why he sealed his voice. That's why he never left." Kun swallowed hard. "And now that he's gone, it's me?" Tien didn't answer. He didn't need to. That night the house creaked with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Not from the wind, not from animals, but from breath. He could hear it under the floorboards, low and slow, as if something vast lay sleeping in the dirt. He lit a candle. The flame flickered, black. The clay jar on the altar had changed. The red thread had unraveled. Wax pooled on the table, shaped like a mouth wide open. And inside the jar, he could swear, something moved. He tried to reseal it, but the wax refused to stick. Every time he touched the jar, his fingers went numb. He buried it behind the house before dawn. The next day, the weather changed again. Snow fell at noon. Actual snow, white and soft and out of season by half a year. It blanketed the village in silence, muffling footsteps and softening screams that never quite reached the air. Children stood beneath the flakes with open mouths, some laughing, some crying, most simply blinking in confusion. But by sunset, the snow melted into blood. It ran down rooftops, through the fields, and soaked into the riverbed. The stones drank it eagerly. Kuhn wandered through the village, searching for something. He didn't know what. Answers, maybe? Or mercy? He passed the elder's hut and paused. The door was open. Inside, the walls had been painted with thick black ink, symbols that pulsed like wounds. At the center of the room sat Old May. Her face was veiled, but her hands moved with purpose, grinding bone, folding cloth, pouring salt into shallow bowls. She didn't look up as Kuhn entered, but she spoke. "You shouldn't be here." Kuhn stepped closer. "I need to know what this is, what I am." She turned a page in the book beside her, an ancient ledger, bound in leather, stained with old water and fingerprints. She pointed to a name written in red. It was his, not his father's, not his grandfather's, his, already there, already written. The land remembers. The stones mark the blood. You were chosen before your breath ever left your mother's mouth. Kuhn's voice trembled. "What happens if I leave?" Old May finally looked up. "You can't." He stepped back. "But if I try?" Her voice deepened. "They'll follow, and not just you, all of us." She handed him a knife. The blade was dull, worn smooth from use. "Bury your voice, or bury the village." Kuhn didn't take the knife. He left the hut and wandered past the scarecrows again. They had moved. Now they faced him, their heads tilted, their cloth mouths twisted in smiles. That night Kuhn didn't sleep. He sat by the altar staring at the empty spot where the jar once rested. He thought of his father, always quiet, always tired, always alone. He thought of the villagers, silent not from ignorance, but from reverence. And he thought of the voices in the stones, how they had begun to say his name, not in anger, in recognition. By morning, every plant in the village had grown twice its size. Cornstalks rose like towers, bamboo coiled like snakes. The air smelled like syrup and rot. Fruit burst before ripening. Flowers melted into slush. And beneath the beauty, beneath the impossible growth, lay decay. Nothing real, nothing right. Just an unnatural bloom. The price of broken silence. The price of blood not buried.
The house had begun to hum. It wasn't a sound one could hear with the ears, but a vibration deep in the floorboards, rising through Kuhn's heels whenever he stood still too long. A faint thrum, like breath held for too many generations. He pressed his hand against the wooden planks beneath the altar. They pulsed once, like a heartbeat, then again. And with each pulse, he heard something. Words, or almost words. A voice that didn't echo in the room, but bloomed inside his chest, like a secret someone else had buried in his lungs. The whispering had started 3 nights ago. At first, it came in his dreams. He'd wake up, gasping, clawing at his own throat, certain that someone had reached into his mouth and was trying to pull something out. Not his tongue, but his voice. One night, he saw a man buried alive.
The man's face was obscured, wrapped in white cloth, mouth sewn shut with red string. He clawed upward through dirt, his fingers bleeding against stone. Each time he tried to scream, only soil poured from his lips. He didn't thrash. He waited, like something had promised it would come for him. And in the dream, Kun was the one watching, from inside the jar. When he told Tien, his uncle grew pale. "There's a space under the house," he whispered. "Your father sealed it shut." Kun stared. "I thought the house was built on stone." Tien shook his head. "Only part of it. The rest sits over a crawl space. Years ago, your father bricked it shut and told no one why." "Why didn't anyone open it?" Tien's eyes darkened. "Because after he did, the whispering stopped." Kun found the trapdoor beneath a pile of firewood in the farthest corner of the kitchen. It looked like nothing, just slats of old wood held shut by rusted nails and a black wax seal melted into the edges. But as he leaned close, he felt warmth rising from the cracks, and a voice, very faint, exhaled his name. "Kun." He didn't want to touch it, but he did. The wood flinched beneath his hand. Not metaphorically. It shuddered, like something beneath had pressed against it from below. That night, he couldn't sleep. He tried. He wrapped himself in blankets, sealed every door, placed the jar back under the altar with a string of salt. Still, the whispering came. "Let me out. You carry what he sealed. You remember because he never let you forget." Kun curled into himself. "I don't remember anything." "Then look." At dawn, he broke the wax and pulled up the boards. The crawl space was shallow, only about 3 feet deep, but it stretched far under the house, vanishing into darkness. The air was wet. Moss grew on the underside of the floor, and something moved in the shadows. He lowered himself in with a lantern. The walls were stone and clay, scorched black in places, etched with markings he didn't recognize. At the far end, he found a small altar, no more than a slab of stone, with melted candles and burned offerings still half present. Charred bits of rice, a child's toy, a photograph of a man with his face scratched out. And beside it, something else. A jar, identical to the one on his altar upstairs, only this one was cracked wide open. Red string hung loose like a tongue. The wax had melted into the soil. And on the inside of the lid, etched into the clay, was his father's name. He turned and saw the bones, half buried in the earth, curled like a sleeping child, a human skeleton wrapped in ritual cloth, mouth sewn shut with real sinew. Red thread still clung to the ribs, salt crusted the eye sockets, and the skull faced him, not in accusation, but in expectation. He scrambled out of the crawl space, breath ragged, hands covered in dirt. He didn't speak to Tien that day, didn't eat, didn't drink. He just sat by the altar, staring at the jar, and wondered what voice had been buried for him. That night, he dreamed again. But this time, the man in the soil was Kun himself, and above him, villagers moved like shadows, faces blank, mouths stitched shut. They circled the grave, chanting in silence. Old May stood at the edge, holding a bowl filled with ash. She poured it into his mouth. "You are the silence," she whispered. "Now feed it." When Kuhn woke, the jar was gone, and in its place sat a folded red cloth. Inside, a single tooth wrapped in wax paper, and a note written in handwriting that wasn't his, and wasn't his father's either. Not buried deep enough. He dug that night. Not under the altar, not behind the house, but beneath the scarecrows. The ground was too soft there, the dirt gave too easily, and beneath the first foot he hit something hard. Wood. A box. Old. Rotted. Covered in red string and sealed with a wax circle shaped like an eye. Inside, hair, teeth, a child's slipper, and a list of names. All of them scratched out, except one. His.
There is a kind of silence that doesn't soothe. It doesn't bring peace. It coils in the throat. It waits, like a secret you were never meant to carry. Kuhn woke with that silence nestled in his chest. He hadn't spoken in 2 days, not out of fear, but because he had nothing left to say. Not to the villagers, not to his uncle, not even to himself. All his questions had begun answering one another, and all of them pointed back to the same place, his blood. The list of names he'd found beneath the scarecrow still trembled in his hand. 12 names, all scratched out with sharp ritual cuts, the kind you make not in rage, but in ritual denial. But his name, Kuhn's name, was the only one untouched, written in red, underlined twice. And beside it, in the same faint, crumbling ink, 3 words: he must remain. He took the list to Tien, laid it on the table. Tien looked at it, then at Kuhn, but said nothing. Kuhn didn't flinch. "I need to know everything." Tien exhaled slowly, and then he told him. Long ago, after the betrayal that cursed Ban Sek, the surviving elders made a vow. They couldn't undo the blood that had been spilled, but they could bind the soul of the traitor's lineage to the land, to bear the guilt, to anchor the voices, to absorb the weight of all that had been stolen. One bloodline, one voice, sealed forever. That was the pact. And each generation, when the feast came, the descendant had to be present, had to stay silent, not just during the ritual, but in life. The moment the chosen heir spoke too much, traveled too far, desired too deeply, the stones would wake, the curse would stir, and the land would twist itself inside out to remind them of their broken history. Kuhn stared at the fire pit. So my father knew. Tien nodded. He lived like a ghost to keep us safe. Kuhn clenched his fists. Then why did he write to me? Why call me back? Tien's voice was soft. He didn't. Kuhn looked up. What? The letter wasn't his. Tien opened an envelope, pulled out a sealed envelope. The handwriting was never his. We found it on the altar with his body. Kuhn's breath caught. You said he was dead before I arrived. Tien hesitated, then nodded once. He took his own voice. Kuhn's knees went weak. He sat on the floor, the room spinning. You mean he...
Cut it out, Tien said quietly. With a carving blade, buried it in salt, took the silence into death. And no one stopped him? We couldn't. He did it during the feast, alone. Khun felt sick. He thought that would end it. Tien didn't speak, because they both knew the answer. It didn't end. It passed on. That night, Khun lit every candle in the house. He dragged the old altar out into the yard, stripped it of its cloth, and poured ash in a circle around it. He sat in the center, the list of names in one hand and the cracked jar in the other. And for the first time, he spoke aloud, not to himself, but to the land. I don't want to be this. The stones didn't answer. The wind didn't move. But from beneath the earth, he felt something shift. A sigh. Not breath, but memory. Then break it. He stood, faced the river. I will. The next day, the unnatural bloom worsened. Flies the size of coins hatched in the trees. Children were born with teeth but no tongues. A woman collapsed in the fields and coughed up twine soaked in salt. And in the village center, the stones began to hum. Not loudly, not rhythmically, but steadily, like a warning held just below hearing. The elders gathered. Khun was summoned. He stood before them without bowing. Old May stepped forward. Her face was veiled in black, but her voice carried. The pact is broken. Khun said nothing. She continued. The silence must be restored. A vessel must remain. One of the other elders spoke. A voice must be unjoined. Someone must bury their voice, as his father did, as his blood demands. Khun stepped forward. I'll do it. The circle stirred, but not with blade or salt. I'll bury it where it began, in the place beneath the house, with the bones, with the truth. Old May tilted her head. Then you'll have to choose. Choose what? But she didn't answer. Not then. She only handed him a bowl, filled with bone rice, soaked in ash, and a folded piece of red cloth. Back at the house, Khun descended once more into the crawl space. This time he brought offerings of his own. His father's comb, the list of names, a page torn from the family prayer book, and a vial of his own blood. He laid them beside the bones, poured salt over the altar, and placed the rice at the center. Then he sat and waited. The voice came after midnight, low, tired, familiar. You were never supposed to return. I know. You left once. They let you. They thought it would skip you. I came back. Why? Khun didn't answer at first. Then, quietly. Because he suffered alone. I won't. The bones shifted. A whisper arose. Then speak and be bound. Khun opened his mouth and spoke his own name, loud, clear, 3 times. The candles blew out. The floor shook, but he kept speaking. He told the story aloud of the betrayal, the sacrifice, the silence that had spread like a disease through the generations. He spoke until his voice cracked, until blood touched his lips, until the jar shattered upstairs. And when he fell silent at last, the earth went still. The stones outside stopped humming. The sky, for the first time in days, turned black again. Real black, without bloom, without fire, without guilt, just night and breath. It began with a bell, but not the bell of the feast. This one rang at noon, bright, shrill, and wrong. It echoed through Bonsek like a needle dragged across an open eye. Hun heard it from deep within the crawl space. He had not slept. His throat was raw from the night before, his voice scraped thin like an offering already burned. But the bell shook the bones beneath him, and something told him this was not a summoning. This was a verdict. By the time he reached the village center, the mist had parted. All the elders were assembled. Old May stood beneath the dead tamarind tree, holding a staff carved with mouthless faces. Around her neck hung the red thread, but this time it was braided with something else, something finer, like hair. Khon's skin prickled. He knew what was coming before she even spoke. "The feast has failed," she said. Her voice was dry and flat, like parchment rubbed against bone. "The pact has been broken. The stones have stirred. The bloom has begun." She raised her hand. In her palm sat a small wooden token, painted red. It was cracked down the middle. "This token was buried at the altar of the last sacrifice." She looked at Hun. "Your father." A murmur rippled through the gathered villagers. They already knew, but knowing was different than naming. Old May continued. "One sacrifice sealed the curse, but to break the silence requires more." She pointed toward the riverbed, where the stones had turned dark once more. "The land demands a reckoning, one from each bloodline." The crowd stilled. No one moved, no one spoke, not even the birds called from the trees. And then, in the silence, she said the words no one dared remember. "Every family must choose one." It was called the election of sacrifice, a law so old that most believed it to be folklore. But in Ban Sek, folklore lived longer than memory. The elders would go house to house. Each household would place a hand over the family altar, and the name would rise, in blood, in ash, or in whisper. Once named, the chosen could not be unchosen. They would be led to the stones on the final night of the bloom, bound and offered, to silence the land once more. Hun watched as the villagers began to retreat into their homes. No one cried, no one protested. They simply obeyed, because they knew the feast had failed and the stones were listening again. By evening, the mist returned, thicker than before. It seeped through the floorboards of homes, into cracks between walls, beneath doorways. It crept like a memory, unwelcome, familiar, impossible to shut out. Hun stayed inside, staring at the altar. The cracked jar was gone. In its place, a bowl of blackened rice. No one had left it there. He would have heard. Yet there it sat, still warm. And beside it, tied in a knot of red string, a tooth. Small, human, recent. He dropped it, and when it hit the ground, it whispered, "Choose her." The next morning, the first family was named. A boy, maybe 7. He stood between his parents, face blank, eyes empty. He didn't cry. He didn't resist. He walked with the elders down to the river and was marked with a smear of soot across his forehead. Hun didn't sleep that night. The next day, it was a grandmother, then a mute girl, then a mother of twins. Each time Hun watched, and each time the stones at the riverbed grew darker, absorbing the fear, feeding on the silence. But on the fifth day, something changed. A man refused. He spat on the altar, threw salt at the elders, shouted that the curse was a lie, that the stones were just stones, and silence was a cage. The next morning, his entire house was gone. Not burned, not destroyed. Gone. No ash, no debris, just a patch of soil that pulsed warm beneath bare feet. And in the riverbed, a new stone, fresh, slick with blood. Tien came to Hun that night. He looked older than ever, sunken eyes, skin like parchment stretched too thin. "They will come tomorrow," he said. Hun nodded. "They'll want our name." Hun looked at him. "And who will you give?" Tien's face twitched. "I'm the last of my line." Hun stood up. "I don't give you." Tien didn't reply. "I don't give you. I'll go myself." Tien's voice was barely audible. "No." Hun stepped forward, voice steady now. "I should have been the only one, from the beginning. My father tried to carry it alone. I won't." But Tien grabbed his arm. "No," he said again. "You're not the sacrifice. You're the seal." That night, Hun dreamed of the man buried in the earth again. Only this time, he wasn't trying to escape. He was digging deeper, willingly, dragging others down with him. He saw their faces, the boy, the mute girl, his father, all of them whispering in unison. "We did not choose. We were chosen." He woke screaming, and the stones outside echoed his breath. At dawn, the elders came. Tien opened the door, did not speak, simply stepped aside. Hun stood at the altar, waiting. Old May entered first. She walked with no staff today, just a bowl of salt in her hands and a scroll sealed in wax. She laid them at his feet, then held out the scroll. He unrolled it. One name, written in red. Hun's aunt. Tien's sister. Long gone, exiled years ago after marrying a man from another province. Banished blood. Hun frowned. "She doesn't live here." Old May nodded. "The land remembers." The next morning, a body washed up in the river. It wasn't Hun's aunt. It was someone else, unmarked, unchosen, not offered. The village said nothing, but that night, every bowl of rice spoiled in its pot, and the soil beneath the scarecrows writhed. The election was nearly complete. Only a few families remained unmarked. Hun's name was still unwritten, but everyone could feel it. The final sacrifice would not be chosen, it would be taken. They came for him before the second bell. Kun heard them outside his window. Soft footsteps muffled by dirt, red cords swaying in the breeze. The elders didn't knock. They waited, like shadows who knew you would eventually open the door because resistance was just another kind of offering. But Kun didn't open it. He fled through the back. The jungle behind Ban Sek was thick with vines and memory. It wasn't a place the villagers entered after dusk. The trees there whispered in forgotten dialects, and the earth had too many graves without names. But Kun ran deeper. His lungs burned, his feet tore open on roots and stone. Branches clawed at his skin like old bones. And still he ran. Because somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice called. Not a whisper now, not a hallucination, a clear voice. A name. His name. Kuhn. He found it just after dawn. A clearing far from the village, circular, too perfect to be natural. At its center, a monolith of river stone, 10 feet tall, blackened with age, carved with a spiral of symbols that made the eyes blur. Around it, smaller stones, dozens of them, arranged in the shape of a mouth, wide and open, as if the clearing itself had been designed to swallow sound. Kuhn stepped forward, dazed. As he approached, the tall stone began to warm. The air thickened. And then it spoke. Not aloud. Inside him. You were never meant to speak. He dropped to his knees. I didn't ask for this. No one does. The carvings pulsed faintly, veins of red glowing beneath the rock. But you answered. He shook his head. I didn't know. You returned. Kuhn looked around the circle. Every smaller stone bore a name. Most were unreadable. Some were burned, but 3 were intact. He recognized one, his father's name. Then he found the stone that called him. It was near the edge of the circle, smaller than the rest, newer. But the name was unmistakable, carved cleanly, unweathered. Kuhn. Below it, in smaller script, born into silence, bound by choice. He reached out. The moment his fingers touched the stone, visions slammed into him. Not memories, not dreams, histories. He saw the first betrayal, a man in white kneeling before soldiers, handing over scrolls filled with names. His face blurred, but the red thread around his neck was unmistakable. He saw the massacre. The river ran red. Children clung to their mothers before vanishing under bayonets and mud. He saw the survivors, broken, bleeding, clutching stones from the river to mark their dead. And he saw the ritual. A girl barely 13, sewn silent and buried alive beneath a tree that would never bear fruit again. The elders said it would bind the pain, preserve the village, but it didn't. It only taught them how to hide it. Kuhn stumbled back, gasping. The stone hummed, and in that vibration, a truth settled. The sacrifices had never been for balance, not to appease spirits, not to cleanse guilt. They were punishments, tools for control, silencing those who remembered too much, naming silence as a virtue, when it had always been fear. He looked around the circle again. The stones weren't tombs. They were mouths, sealed, starved, and now hungry again. Because Kuhn had dared to speak, and because the village had run out of lies to tell itself. He turned to leave, but something stopped him. A sound. At first he thought it was rain, then breath, then sobbing. He followed it through a gap in the stone ring, down a slope into a gully filled with tangled roots. There, half buried in mud, he found a child, or what remained of one. Mouth stitched shut, eyes open but unseeing, still warm. He knew that face. The boy from the first offering. But he had been chosen days ago, buried, taken. Kuhn knelt beside him, and the boy turned his head ever so slightly and whispered without moving his lips, "They never stopped." Kuhn ran. He didn't remember the path, he didn't remember the cuts or the blood. He only remembered the boy's voice, the first true voice he'd heard in days, and the rage it carried. When he reached the edge of the village, the sky was red. Not from bloom, from smoke. One of the homes was burning, and the people stood in rows, silent, unmoving, like scarecrows dressed in ash. At the front, old May waited. Beside her, a stone basin, and inside it, a knife. The villagers did not chase him. They didn't need to. When Kuhn stumbled into the clearing at the village edge, covered in mud and blood and breathless dread, they were already waiting. Neat lines, bare feet, red cords around their necks like garlands of complicity. No weapons, just the weight of silence. Teen stepped forward first, eyes hollow, hands raised, not in surrender, but in acceptance. Kuhn opened his mouth to speak, to tell them what he had seen, to say the stones were lying, or the pact was a trick, or none of this had ever been about peace. But his voice caught in his throat, not from fear, from grief, because he saw something in their eyes he hadn't expected: relief. They wanted it to end, even if it meant ending him. Old May approached slowly, barefoot through ash. In her hands a coil of red rope, long, thick, stained at the center with something darker than dye. Behind her the stone basin steamed gently, though no fire burned beneath it. Inside, the ritual blade, curved, worn, used. She held out the rope. Teen took it, and Kuhn did not fight. They led him through the village like a ghost already forgotten, past the altar where his father once lit incense in silence, past the home with the door still smeared in soot from the earlier fire, past the scarecrows, now multiplied, standing shoulder to shoulder, each bearing the face of someone recently missing, and finally to the riverbed, where the stones waited and bled. The altar had changed, no longer a flat stone. Now it was a hollow circle, dug deep, ringed in teeth, the kind of place that remembered everything. They tied Kuhn's wrists and ankles with the red rope, laid him on the slab. Old May stood above him, hands lifted skyward. The others knelt, even Teen. No one spoke, but in the silence, the earth began to murmur. Stones beneath Kuhn's back pulsed. Voices, hundreds of them, pressed into his skin like cold breath. Seal it again. He is the blood. Flesh for silence. Kuhn turned his head. Behind the altar, children stood in rows, the chosen, still alive, but empty, eyes glassy, mouths open yet incapable of sound. They weren't gone, not yet. They were waiting, like seeds waiting for soil, waiting for him to be buried in their place. Old May lifted the blade. It was rusted, not from disuse, but from memory. Kuhn closed his eyes. The wind changed. The sky dimmed, And just as the knife descended, he spoke. No more. The words were not loud, not shouted, but they split the ritual like thunder splits still water. The rope burned away, the altar cracked, the wind howled, not across the trees, but through the stones, and the voices rose. He speaks, he defies, the pact is broken. Old May dropped the blade. It clattered to the stones like a scream turned solid. The children began to cry, and the riverbed breathed. From the cracks beneath the altar, blood surged, not in spurts, in tides. It spilled over Kuhn's legs, over the stone, over the villagers' feet. But it wasn't warm. It was cold, remembered blood, blood that had never dried, and within it, shapes rose. Hands, faces, figures made of soil and memory, ancestors, unburied, unwashed, unsilenced. One of them stepped forward. Her mouth was sewn shut, but her eyes were her mother's. She reached for him. Kuhn did not flinch. He stood, dripping in red, and said the words he had feared all his life. I am not your seal. The figures froze. The stone stilled. Even the mist held its breath. And then everything shattered. The stones burst, not exploded, but unraveled, as if they were never meant to be whole. Each name inscribed upon them peeled away in ash. The earth cracked in a spiral, and from its center a scream erupted. Not his, not the villagers, not even the ancestors, but the traitors. The man who had given the names, who had started it all, who had never been punished, only hidden, only worshipped as a warning. The scream tore through the sky and was gone. When Kuhn opened his eyes, the altar was gone. The riverbed was empty. No blood, no stones, no children. Just silence. True silence. Not the forced kind, not the kind bought with flesh, but the kind that comes after something ends. He turned. The villagers still knelt, but their cords had fallen away. Teen wept. Old May lay motionless, and in the air, for the first time, the birds sang again. For the first time in generations, the stones were silent. No bleeding, no humming, no whispered names clinging to the back of the throat like dust. Just silence. Not sacred, not ritual, but emptied. Like something ancient had been pulled loose from the roots of the earth and left the soil hollow in its wake. Kuhn stood alone in the center of the riverbed. The altar was gone. The cracked stones had crumbled into ash. Even the children, the marked, had vanished. No footprints, no sound. Only the weight of what had not happened. The sacrifice had failed, but no retribution came. The sky remained dim, the wind still, the village behind him eerily quiet. And yet, he knew something had changed. The curse had broken, but it hadn't left. It had unmoored. Tien found him just before dusk. His eyes were red from weeping, his voice brittle. "They're gone," he whispered. "Who?" Kuhn asked. Tien didn't answer. He only looked toward the horizon, where black clouds had begun to swirl, not with thunder, but with shape, like something searching. Kuhn stepped closer. What did we release? Tien looked at him, hollow. Whatever the silence held back. That night, it rained, for the first time in weeks. But the rain wasn't water. It was red, thin like diluted ink, and warm. It stained rooftops, pooled at doorsteps, washed through the fields and returned the scarecrows to the soil. No one left their homes. No one lit candles. The village had become a waiting room, waiting for whatever would come now that the voices were free. Kun sat by his father's old room. The cracked altar had been swept clean. The red string that once sealed the jar now hung like a limp vine from the ceiling. He touched the floorboards beneath him. They were warm, still breathing, and beneath them, a heartbeat. Not his, not the village's, something older. At midnight, he dreamed again, but it was no longer a memory. This dream was new. He stood in a field of broken mouths, not stones, not skulls, mouths, rooted in the dirt, whispering truths they were never allowed to speak. The wind carried screams in 100 dialects, not of pain, but of release. And in the distance, something moved. Not a man, not a god, a figure made of smoke and rope and bone, with no face, only a mouth, sewn shut and screaming from within. He woke to thunder, real thunder, but no lightning, no wind, just the sound of something breaking in the sky. He opened the window. The rain had stopped, but every puddle reflected something that wasn't there. A figure, standing behind him, watching, waiting. Tien came at dawn. His skin was pale, his breath shallow. "They're starting to forget," he whispered. "Who?" "Everyone. The children, the names, the feast." Kun frowned. "Forget?" Tien nodded slowly, as if the silence took something with it. Kun walked through the village that morning. Doors were ajar, bowls overturned. Red threads lay trampled in the mud. And yet, life had returned. Chickens wandered the roads. Frogs sang in the flooded rice paddies. But the people, they looked empty, like dolls that had forgotten who had once played with them. Only the elders still remembered, and even they were beginning to lose words. May sat by her fire pit, running salt through her fingers, mouthing a prayer without sound. Kun knelt beside her. She didn't look up, but her hands moved, slowly, tracing a circle, then a slash through the center. He recognized it, the old symbol for binding. He took her hand. "What's coming?" he asked. She looked at him then, just briefly, and whispered, "Nothing. That's what we let in, and it's hungrier than anything that ever wanted blood." That night, the fog returned. Not mist, but fog, thick, yellow, and inside it, footsteps. Kun lit a candle and walked through the village. Every home was silent, but the fog was filled with whispers, not from the stones, not from the dead, from the curse itself, now free, now formless, now listening from every shadow. He made it back to the riverbed, and at the center, a new altar. He hadn't built it. No one had. But there it was, stone, smooth, pulsing. And on it, a single red thread tied in a noose. Beneath it, words carved freshly into the rock. The seal has no keeper, and the silence has learned to speak.
Fog covered Ban's sock like a burial shroud. It did not roll in from the mountains. It did not crawl in from the river. It rose from the ground, from the walls, from the skin. By dawn, Kuhn could barely see the steps beneath his feet. Shapes blurred, shadows stretched. Every sound became a question. He walked slowly, holding a lantern whose light was swallowed whole before it reached the end of his arm. And somewhere beyond the veil, a voice followed him. Kuhn. It wasn't whispering. It wasn't beckoning. It was familiar. His father's voice, clearer than memory. He turned toward it. There was nothing, just fog and silence where a name had once been. He tried to return home, but the paths were gone. Ban's sock had unraveled itself, not destroyed, but forgotten. The well where children used to splash, gone. The shrine beside the tamarind tree, gone. Only the houses remained, standing like paper lanterns, hollow and waiting. But even they had begun to flicker, roofs sagging, windows blinking in and out of place, as if uncertain whether they had ever existed at all. Inside one of them, Kuhn saw May sitting by a cold hearth. She was mouthing something. A chant? A prayer? He stepped closer and called to her. May, can you hear me? Her head turned, too quickly, like a puppet yanked on a string. But she didn't answer. Her mouth kept moving. Words, but no sound. He stepped inside. Her eyes flicked toward him, and for a heartbeat she smiled. Not at him, through him. Then she blinked, and her face crumbled into ash. He gasped, but when he blinked again, she was whole. As if her disappearance had been a mistake the fog had corrected. The voice came again, this time from behind him. Kuhn. He turned. It wasn't his father anymore. It was his own voice, speaking from the fog, calling itself back. He ran, not out of fear, out of instinct, the kind that says run from what sounds like you but isn't. But the fog did not allow escape. It coiled, it pulled, it remembered. Every step took him deeper, into memories he never lived, names he never knew. He found himself by the river, only the river wasn't dry. It ran red now, not blood, but pigment. Paint poured from broken mouths, winding past houses now sunken into the soil. Children played on the banks, laughing, but none had faces, just blank skin where eyes and mouths should have been. He cried out to them. They turned and spoke in perfect unison. You spoke. You broke the silence. Now the silence breaks you. His voice cracked. What do you want? A moment passed. Then from everywhere and nowhere. We want you to forget. The fog thickened. He clutched at his chest, trying to remember the faces of his parents, his uncle, his name. Each slipped like smoke. What color were his mother's eyes? What did his house smell like? Who had he been before the feast? Gone. All of it. The fog was not air. It was memory turned to mist. And it had unmoored the final anchor that held the curse in place. Remembrance. The land didn't need voices anymore. It needed silence through forgetting. Kuhn fell to his knees, tried to recite his name. Only a breath escaped. He looked down and saw the red thread wrapped around his wrist. He hadn't tied it. It had tied itself.
He screamed. No sound came, only fog. The fog did not lift, but it stopped chasing him, as if it had realized he was no longer worth chasing. Kuhn wandered the edges of Bon Saek like a dreamless ghost. He passed hollow homes, temples made of dust, doorways where no one stood. The river no longer ran. The rain no longer fell. Even the birds, so triumphant in their return, had vanished again. Silence had claimed everything, not by force, but by erosion. One thought circled in his mind over and over again. If memory is gone, what remains of me? He remembered the scrolls, the ones the elders had once burned in secret, the ones that listed names, not of those sacrificed, but those who had refused. He remembered the jar, the bone, the cracked altar. He remembered the stone that had called his name. But now, even those memories were soft at the edges, uncertain, like voices carried too far across too many winters. Still, one memory refused to fade. The mountain, where the first tomb had been carved, where the trader's lineage had begun, where the silence had been born. He packed nothing. He told no one. There was no one left to tell. He walked west. The old trail revealed itself slowly, as if the earth remembered him, even if the people did not. He climbed through groves of leafless trees, past forgotten shrines swallowed by vines, until he reached the ridge. There, nestled between the rocks, was the opening, a hole in the stone, a wound in the mountain, a tunnel carved by hand, lit by nothing, and still warm. He entered. The air inside was thick with salt, not the sea. Preservation. His steps echoed, but only once. Then the sound was absorbed. The walls were lined with jars, hundreds, each bound with red thread, each sealed in wax, each etched with a name. He stopped before one marked simply K. It pulsed beneath his palm, alive, waiting. At the center of the tomb, a basin, carved from bone, stained from centuries of remembering. He knelt and took out what little he had. A tooth, his own broken during the last ritual. A lock of his father's hair. Ash from the altar. Salt from May's bowl. A ribbon of red cloth he had found tied to his ankle when he woke. He ground them together in silence, not out of respect, but because he could no longer form sound, not even a breath. His voice had already begun to leave him. He poured the mixture into a fresh jar, unmarked, unclaimed. He dipped his fingers into the wax beside the flame, sealed it, and before it hardened, he whispered one last word into the jar. His name. It echoed once, trapped, then faded. He tied it shut with the red cord, 3 times clockwise, once counter, just like his father had, then placed it on the shelf beside the others. Something shifted in the tomb, a wind that did not belong underground. It circled him, lifted the dust, blew out the candle, and whispered softly, "Now you may forget." He left the tomb as the sun broke through the fog. For the first time in weeks, the world had color again. Not vibrant, not loud, but real. Bonsaik stood below, small and waiting. Smoke rose from chimneys. Children chased frogs in the rice field. Men repaired fishing nets. Women swept doorsteps clean of red petals the trees had never grown before. But no one looked for him. No one remembered him. Even Tian, walking the path toward the shrine, passed by without pause. Kun stood beneath the tamarind tree, unseen, untethered, unwritten. He touched his throat. No sound came, but inside he felt peace, not because he had won, but because the curse had changed form, and he had become its final vessel. Not a sacrifice, not a victim, but a keeper. He would stay in Bonsaik, watch it flourish, watch it forget, and carry the silence so no one else would have to. Not for a year, not for a generation, but until the red thread unraveled on its own, and the jars cracked one last time. Bonsaik never spoke of what happened, because there was no one left who remembered. The names of the chosen were gone. The river no longer bled. The stones were dust beneath the rice fields. And yet, something lingered. Not quite a shadow, not quite a memory. A feeling, like being watched by a room you once knew well, now rearranged by time. The villagers resumed their lives. Children laughed again. Fires burned clean. Mothers sang lullabies that had no stories behind them, only sound. It was peace, they said. Hard-earned, long overdue. But it didn't feel like peace. It felt like a breath held too long, a sky that never changed, a season that stretched endlessly, neither growing nor withering, just waiting. The scarecrows returned. No one built them, but one morning, there they stood, one in each field, one in front of the old altar, one at the bend in the river, their faces blank, their hands open. Each had a red thread tied around its neck. No one touched them, no one removed them, and soon no one saw them at all. Kun watched from the edge of the village. He no longer lived among them, no longer ate their food or walked their paths. He had become a part of the landscape, a story never told. Some said a spirit guarded the mountain now, one that kept the fog at bay, that walked between rows of bamboo in the deep hours of the night. They didn't know his name. They didn't wonder where he came from. They only knew the silence held, and the sky had not rained red in years. He kept the jars hidden deep in the tomb, some cracked with age, some pulsed in dreams, but none had spoken since the day he buried his own voice. Until one morning, he found a new jar, placed neatly in the center of the basin, warm, untied, sealed in wax. No name, just a whisper inside. I remember. He did not panic. He did not speak. He lifted the jar and buried it in salt. But that night, the fog returned, thin, almost playful, A dog barked without reason. And for the first time in years, a child cried out in her sleep and said a name no one had taught her. Coon. The next morning, she didn't remember. But he did. He sat by the river alone and watched the water pass over the stones no one could see anymore. The season had not changed, and it would not, because the curse had never been about blood. It had always been about memory, and memory never dies. He walked to the edge of the village that evening, watched a woman sweep her doorstep, watched an elder carry water in silence, watched a group of children play without songs. And above them all, the sky, frozen in amber, neither day nor dusk, just a breath that would never finish exhaling. Coon turned and walked back towards the mountain, to the jars, to the tomb, to the silence he now carried like skin. He would wait, not because he hoped the curse would end, but because someone would come again. They always did. A voice would call, a child would remember, a stone would whisper, and he would be there, buried in the season that never ends, because silence, once born, is never truly broken. It simply waits for the next voice brave enough to speak.